Great, thanks.
No injury, please.
Yep. Hi, everybody. My name is Howard Phillips. Really informal talk today, so I hope to just blast through some background really quick and then let you guys ask whatever questions you want about anything about the decade of the 80s at Nintendo. I had a unique ride there because I was the 6th person on the payroll when Nintendo first started up down in Seattle. And then I left in 90 or 91, just after the release of the Super NES. So I saw them go from an arcade game company, toy company, all the way through to kind of owning the home video game market. So that said, Nintendo of America. Nintendo at the time started up in Tukwila, which is a suburb of Seattle. It was Mr. Arakawa plus 2 salesmen plus 1 person, Howard Lincoln. Oh, by the way, I'm not Howard Lincoln. A lot of people think that because my name is Howard and his name is Howard, we're one and the same. And, you know, it'd be easier if my name was John. People would say, oh, obviously there's more than one John. Everybody assumes there's one Howard. There's more than one. He was the corporate attorney for the company, and so he worked with Arakawa, but he wasn't on the payroll until later in the venture. You may know me as well as the Fun Club president or the Nintendo guy or the game master for Nintendo. That was one of the hats that I wore while I was there. Helped them promote the company, served as the Anglo face on the Japanese company. It's hard to imagine these days, but back then it was really a different world that we lived in. And there was concern that yet another Japanese company was bringing in some bad video game system. And so they didn't want, they wanted somebody who could promote the company that seemed like they were more American or something. I also was an editor of Nintendo Power Magazine, which we sent out to all the kids, and featured in the magazine in the Howard Nestor comic. And at the same time I was doing all that promotion work, I was also creative director for Nintendo of America. A lot of people are not aware of kind of the extent of the role, but basically I worked helping westernize all of the titles that were developed in Japan, as well as working with the newfound developers that we had both in the United States and also overseas, for instance, the guys at Rare, Chris and Tim Stamper. But I also was a guy who wore the bow tie and ran around the country and stood in front of all the cameras, and I authored the books on how to play the different games, and really was the face of the company from a lifestyle standpoint. Immortalized in claymation figures, like a little guy with a bow tie, blah, blah, blah. And in the magazine, in the Nintendo Power Magazine. Did a lot of television interviews. Thankfully, all of this was pre-internet. And so the cool thing about that is I did a lot of horribly embarrassing stuff, but it's just not posted anywhere. I love it. Including things like this, to promote the one on the upper left. That's a family ending move there. Anyway, lots of fun. I left in 90 or 91. It's a little bit of a blur to go down to Lucasfilm to work on the ranch to run their learning game company and also to be creative director for their nascent console division. They had been a PC game company and they wanted to do console because console was a big deal in 90-91. That said, let me kind of jump back to where I started, which was back where many of you started maybe, which is back with Pong and games like Pong. I was first exposed to Pong with the Odyssey system. My dad brought home an Odyssey out of the blue, and it was the coolest thing. I mean, for kids these days, they think cars that are green or blue or red or something like that is just normal. For me, I grew up in an age where we had black cars and brown cars and silver cars, and ours had a little bit of red and wood on the side, and that was really cool. And then along came Hot Wheels, and suddenly we had these metallic colors, etc. Well, having something that actually moved on the television screen was just awesome when I was a kid. And so I started playing video games like everybody in the arcades, because you couldn't play them at home. Well, you could play them at home, but in a very limited way. But there was a lot of proliferation of really cool, bright, vibrant colors going on in the arcade, so I started playing those. And this particular game, Radar Scope, was just another example of a shooter. You'd sit at the bottom of the screen, go back and forth like Space Invaders, and shoot it at the top of the screen. There wasn't a lot of variety going on in games back then. I mean, limited variety, certainly compared to today. And then this guy and his dad, Mr. Arakawa, Minoru Arakawa, and Yamauchi, decided to get into the arcade game business. They'd been a little dabbling in the arcade business, and they'd done a couple of really awful rip-off games, Hellfire and some other games, including the one that I just showed, Radar Scope. Or is it Spacefire? I think that's Radar Scope. But they had this new game that they developed, and they really wanted to bring it to market in the US. Prior to that, they brought over a whole bunch of radar scopes, and they were sitting in New Jersey in a warehouse, and they weren't selling. And they cost on the order of I think $1,000 a pop, and they had 2,000 of them, so they had a lot of inventory. But they had this new game, and so what they wanted to do is take all the old games and convert them into this new game, which was really cool because it had 4 screens instead of having one screen like this. It had 4 screens. Again, it's kind of like the blue and black cars and brown cars versus having cars that are lime green, etc. It was hard to believe back then that you could have a game that had actually multiple screens on it. It was so cool. And they wanted to convert them into these different types of arcade cabinets. And so they just hired on a bunch of people. I've never showed this picture to anybody before, but that's Mr. Arakawa in the back. Next to that monkey is Donkey Kong, but he's made of butter, which is kind of embarrassing because it had these big thumbprints on the back of it. Because on the left there, the woman is Yoko, Mr. Arakawa's wife, and she walked behind it, was pushing her finger into his butt. A couple of salesmen on the right, I'm over there on the right, and then a couple of the staff from Japan. But it was really a small company at that time, and it was entirely dedicated to doing nothing but taking these old Radar Scope games and converting them into Donkey Kong games. And so my role was to run the warehouse, and something like this. This is actually the one up in Redmond. The one in Tukwila was a little bit smaller than this. But we get in just crates and or containers full of games. And these are, each one of those little boxes there with the white label on it is about a refrigerator size, 250 pounds. You get 44 of them, 11,000 pounds in a 40-foot container. And we ship them in, and then we take the backs off of them, and we pull out the PC boards and we put in new PC boards, and we take off the side stickers and the control decals, and we turn them into Donkey Kong machines. And then after we did that, then we started doing other games like this one, Donkey Kong Jr. At the same time, there's maybe some games that Nintendo did that people aren't so familiar with, like Sky Skipper, which was interesting. You flew a little guy and you did loop games. Popeye, for some reason we had a license with King Features. We did Popeye game. Not very successful, certainly not compared to Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong was the biggest game since Pac-Man. We sold over 120,000, and I think we were making something like $500 a pop. So it was a huge windfall for a very, very small company to do that. During that period in 92 and 93, so I was a young kid, I was like 23 or 24, I was the largest shipper in the port of Seattle of all the companies that Boeing and all these companies that have been there for years, because I was bringing in like 150 containers over like a week or so. Of these things just came flowing in as the demand was so high for the games. Nintendo was also a toy company, as many people know, so we were doing Game & Watches, things like that. It was kind of a high end of there was lots of little electronic games, but Nintendo really went after the high end. It had a metal face on it, etc., so it wasn't plastic. And we sold a fair amount of these, actually. It was a pretty good business for the company. At the same time, making more games. Mario Brothers came out. After Donkey Kong, this was the first introduction of the name Mario for Mario. Interesting thing about this is I was running the route for Nintendo as well as running the warehouse. So I take all of the new games like Popeye and Sky Skipper and Mario Brothers out to our different locations in the Seattle area, and then manage the coin drop and see what kind of revenue we got from them, and contrast that with revenue from other games, and also manage the dip switches, the number of lives, time on the game, that sort of thing, to try and optimize the coin drop. Well, in advance of getting Mario Brothers, one of the things we did, which is a little bit unusual, Joust was popular. I don't know if you guys remember Joust. So the Nintendo in Japan requested that we send a Joust game to them, which is kind of exorbitant. You know, sending this big thing over to them for no apparent reason. So we sent it over. And then another interesting anecdote associated with that, before I get to Mario, is that we also did repairs on some of the games. And one of the things that we found is in a broken game once is that as you were playing Donkey Kong, imagine, if you will, imagine, oh, I put the bad screen up there. The first one, sorry, that's what happens when you make the slides 20 minutes before they talk. But what we found is there was one version of it where the background, the magenta colored girders would disappear and it would be completely black. And so you'd have to play it just by memory. But having played it so many times, you just get that memory down, that muscle memory of how to play it. So you could actually play it, even though it was in this broken state. And so we would challenge ourselves on this one broken board to play it. We called it Nightcom. Mr. Arakawa came out one evening, we were playing, what are you doing? I said, we're playing Nightcom, it's really cool, check it out. And I worked with John Pedersen, who was one of the techs there, and we hooked it up so that when they found out it was just one of the EEPROMs was bad, so we figured out that we could put in a new EEPROM, but then if we just shorted out one of the legs on it, we could get it to switch into Nightcom mode. So we had this little switch where you just go bang, 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 bang. So one person would stand there and go bang, 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 and turn on and off the background, while the other person tried to play it. So it was really kind of fun. Well, so Mr. Arakawa had seen that, and we'd sent Joust over, and then Miyamoto sent back Mario Brothers. And I don't know if you remember, if you can see the parallels between the layout of Mario Brothers. They're, the little guys are not sitting on ostriches with wings, but they ran back and forth and went up and down on the platforms. And then also, if you recall, on the higher levels of Mario Brothers, the backgrounds drop out and it becomes completely black and you have to play them by memory. So that was kind of the start of Nintendo Japan starting to listen a little bit to outside influences as far as creative ideas or things that they could do to make the games more interesting and fun. We also shipped more Game & Watches, and they made the dual screen ones, and they made these bigger ones. It was kind of goofy. But then again, they were still selling because we had a good brand with Donkey Kong. And every day in the warehouse, it seemed like I get new boxes in from Japan. I was a shipping warehouse manager and also running the booth and helping giving feedback on the games, etc. But I get these bills of lading. I get a box sealed up tight. I get a bill of lading on it, and it would have just Japanese writing, and it would say Toys and Games, and then kanji or Paragon or something, and I couldn't read Japanese. So I opened it up, and it was always like Christmas. Opening these things, I get these boxes, had no idea what it was. Arakawa wouldn't give me an advance warning that anything was coming in. And one day in '83, this thing showed up, and it was pretty ugly, but it was really cool because it played Donkey Kong dead nuts on to what was in the arcade. And back then, the games that were in the home systems were a slight version of what was in the arcades. The arcades were getting much more powerful, and the home systems just couldn't keep up with it. And I thought, holy cow, it's exactly like it, including with the bad first screen that I've got up here in a duplicate slide, sorry. But it was the same game. It was so cool. I was going, Mr. Arakawa, this is great. To heck with all this Atari stuff, this 2600, now 5200 stuff. We got to get this thing out there. We got to release it. It'll be like the next big thing. And Mr. Arakawa said, well, no, not really, because back then, the arcades business was just taking off. There was all these really great, powerful, visually strong arcade games. I mean, I look at that list and think of the number of hours that I spent playing all those games. It was just so much fun. And in the home system, we had the whole debacle going on with retailers and a glut of really crappy software, and ET is the quintessential example that everybody uses. So Nintendo just said, no, Mr. Arakawa said, no, we're not going to do that. The market's not ready for it. So we just made more video games. And the VS system, including playing some of the home games that were available in Japan for Famicom, they made the VS system so it could play those games in an arcade format. is kind of faulty design because you didn't play based on your skill level. You paid for time, and so regardless of whether you're good or bad, you only got a certain number of times. So it wasn't a very good game, very good system. But then this really amazing game came along, Super Mario Brothers, which was just a super blast to play. And then I was playing it in the warehouse. Again, I get another box, open it up. Here's another bunch of cartridges from Nintendo in Japan, of Famicom cartridges, and I plug them in, and we couldn't tell which one was which because they just had Japanese writing on them. They were pre-release versions, so no logos or anything like that. And this game was exceptionally fun, really great. And I played it and played it and played it. And I got up to the end here, and on the right-hand side you can see this isn't the screen that I played, but on the right-hand side you can see on the other, behind Bowser, there's the brick wall and there's the lever or the axe or whatever it is, and the hole that goes through the wall. But when I played it, there was just this black hole over there. There was nothing over there. And I must have dropped Bowser, I don't know, like 24 times easily in the space of 2 days, trying to figure out how to beat this game. I'm just trying. Mr. Arakawa would come back and he'd watch me. What do you think? Do you like this game? I said, it's great, but I'm really getting frustrated. I can't beat the game. He'd go, he'd go back to his office. Well, one time he came in finally and said, what do you think? And I said, this is the best game. We've got to release this, but I just can't figure out how to beat it. He says, oh, it's not finished. So anyway, with the advent of, this is now going into end of '84, early '85, with the advent of Mario Brothers and the change in the marketplace, I think the retailers had sufficient distance between them and the ET and the crash of the early '80s to consider something different. And so Nintendo said, well, we're going to make a run for it. We're going to come up with something new. So if you look at this, you can see it actually doesn't look like the lunchbox and the controller that we're used to. And the zapper doesn't look like it either. In '84, Nintendo went to the, what's it called, E3? It was a Consumer Electronics Show. Yeah. And they tested this out with retailers just to see whether people liked it or not. And pardon? Yeah, but Arakawa, not to go in with less than a full deck, said, well, we need something to really separate it from the old stuff, from the old Ataris that were not successful. Even though we think the games are more important, we need something extra. And they've done this, again, a toy company in Japan, they've done this goofy robot-y thing. And so they said, well, we're just going to make it all about the robot. And so we're going to put this big robot, and everybody's just going to have these robots because it's going to be high-tech and new. And then on top of that, we've also got this light gun, so we're going to throw that in there because we want to make as great a distance as we can between the old systems and our new systems, even though it was really all about the games, as opposed to Rob the Robot or the Zapper. And then we needed games for it. So Mr. Arakawa came in and said, well, by then there was about 40 games available in Famicom in Japan. He said, so which games should we release? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, we want a range of games. We need about, I don't know, a dozen, 18, something like that. Which games do you think? So I wrote up a list and wrote up my reasons for all of that. Again, I'm just a warehouse guy, but I've been running the route and doing all that stuff. So I came up with a list of, I think, 15 or 16 games, and Bernard Arakawa didn't, a lot of them were no-brainers, because there were some really awful games in Japan that just didn't translate. Some that were culturally wrong, like Mahjong and things like that. But I came up with a list, and then Arakawa took it and modified a little bit, and that's the list that we ended up with for shipping games for the NES. Then once we launched it, we didn't launch across the U.S. as many as you know. We launched just in New Jersey, New York area. And in addition to taking the product back there to sell, we also did demonstrations everywhere all the time. We set up these little black stations we set up in the middle of shopping malls. And so I would work, and with a couple other guys, we'd work about 8 hours a day just doing shipping stuff. And then in the afternoon, we'd go and we'd install these different demonstrator units in the different stores, Toys R Us and on and on. And then on the weekends, on the nights and the weekends, we would run these demos where we'd let people come in and play the game, and we'd give them a little spiel on why it was so cool and fun. We did that for the 3 months run up to Christmas of '05. And I my bow tie back then and run around. And Nintendo started pushing me further into the forefront for that, so I ended up getting a lot of coverage. But I was still warehouse manager. And so the cool thing about that was there was stuff continuously coming in, all sorts of new games from the Famicom in Japan, which was 2 years in advance. So Arakawa said, well, we need help to try and figure out which games are the strongest games, because they didn't want to repeat the debacle of ET. Now this is a really touchy subject for us. We're in a creative industry, right? So who gets to be the arbiter of what's good or what's bad? And the short answer is the customers. So we had a system that was in its infancy in Japan where they would test games with both in a larger group within the organization there as well as with real customers. So I mirrored that system in the United States where we tested, there was a small circle, it was called the Big Three, it was myself, and Mr. Oda, who was the accountant guy. We'd play the games right away as soon as like same day they came in. And we had a larger group and it was a bunch of game counselors that worked for me. There were 6 guys and they would play the games. And then larger still, we had about 200 people who were in the call center who would who worked on the 800 lines answering tips and things, and they would evaluate the games. And we do it in a standard way, and it was subjective measures. What do you think of this, and what do you think of that? And I total all those up, and then look at it across the board for every game. And out of that say, well, these games are fun, right? These games are good. These ones, for whatever reason, these very few, these 5% stand out. And these 5 or 10% are the ETs. And from consumers' perspective, not from marketing. I mean, marketing didn't have anything to do with the efforts that I was working on. But then this one really cool game came in. Again, open a box, Japanese writing, etc. All Japanese. This is where I learned hiragana, was I played all the way through Zelda, just looking at the Japanese. So when you go into the little room and there'd be the gal with the candle, and she would say, it was in Japanese, and I don't read Japanese. So I'd write that down, and then I'd go around to other places in the game. But just a phenomenal game. I think actually it's my favorite game. As much as I like Mario Brothers, historically it's the game I think I spent the most hours with and had the most Yahoo moments when I found that I could bomb a hole in a dungeon wall, or found that I could burn a bush. It was just all so good. So more. And just tons of games. By the time I left in 91, or excuse me, 91, I'd seen about 500 games come through Nintendo, and I had played them all. And to my knowledge and recollection, I beat them all, because that was my job, was to play through and make sure that there was nothing untoward in the games. And I had people who worked with me doing that, but it was my job to be on the front lines and be able to do that. Part of the reason for me kind of jettisoning in 91 is it got to a point where I just realized no one person could keep up with that flow of games and have that position of speaking with authority with regard to all the games. So if some kid came up to me and said, how do I get past level 3? I didn't know in some of the newest games, and that just was untenable to me. But since then I've done a lot of stuff. After I left Nintendo, I ran development in a couple different groups. Most recently, I was at Epic Games, the people who do Unreal Tournament. I spent 10 years at Microsoft. Wow. They're in Redmond. That was really the primary reason I ended up working for them. But got to see the launch of Xbox with them, and it was fun times. And most recently, did Infinity Blade for iOS, which was the game of the year 2 years ago. And now I've got some new stuff going on, but I don't want to talk about that. I'd rather open it up for questions and ask me anything about anyone, businesses, games, anything. Yes?
Regarding Zelda, who decided regarding the translation? Because the game is full of, it's full with mistakes, like peninsula being spelled with 2 N's, the manual mentioning the screen for the full voice when it's not working in the NES, only on the Famicom. I mean, who was in charge of that?
Yeah. So the question is, who's responsible for the localization of the writing in, for instance, Zelda, which has many errors in it. And originally all of that was done in Japan, and it wasn't until about 90 that Nintendo got serious and real and actually had a localization department that was formal in its role, that was set up in Nintendo America to do that. Before that, we got the Japan English in everything, everywhere. It was fun. It was just great.
But the NOA didn't at all just go for the game to tried to correct it or anything? I mean,
Short answer is yes. We did try and correct stuff, but it was a very small operation. Even when we were being very successful, our staff was growing like this, and the business and the volume was going like that as far as tasks at hand. So we just didn't have time to attend to the detail of everything. Granted, if we'd hired a lot more people and spent more time managing people, we would have been more like Microsoft and forgot about the fun, right? So we really just focused on gameplay first and foremost, and a little bit spelling errors didn't hurt the fun of the game. But good question. Yeah.
The original Super Mario Brothers 2 that was released in Japan, of course we didn't get it over here until the Super Nintendo. I was just curious if you were involved in that decision. I heard the rumor was that they decided that it was too hard for us Americans.
I think that's the rumor. Bottom line is I think Miyamoto stubbed his toe. It was no fun. There's two main things in it that made it no fun. First one is you had poison mushrooms. So you'd be running along and just pick this, you bump stuff and bounce into things, and every time in Mario, when you do that, something good would happen, and you grab it right away, but suddenly you go bang, get something good, bang, get something good, bang, oh, it was bad. It's like, what? I just got slapped upside the head for doing something I've been doing for 3 years having fun at. And then the other thing is you added in things like wind. I don't know if whoever's played it, but for instance, you do this jump up and then there'd be this gust of wind that would make you go, whoa, and then drop into a chasm. Again, two things that really made it unpredictably hard. I mean, granted, you could say, well, it's predictable if it's a bad mushroom, but not the way people played, which was kind of just full-on, run-through, charge the game, everything that you picked up, except for the stuff you could see in advance, was good. But suddenly now you have to slow down and be more methodical, so that being more methodical and then the unpredictable nature of the wind, to me, were just showstoppers. It's like, why is he doing this? Anyway, it wasn't just sentiment on our side, it was also sentiment in Japan that it wasn't the best game around, and that's why we ended up with Doki Doki Panic being the game converted over.
Now, were you involved with that, or was that something they made in Japan and say, hey, sell this to me?
They did that. I told Eric how I didn't like Super Mario, and with raised eyebrows as much as you can, and kind of being semi-differential to in the Japanese culture. But I wasn't aware that Doki Doki Panic was being converted over until it actually showed up. And a lot of the stuff, again, they just have these boxes that said toys and games, and that's what the customs people would say, what is it? And I'd say, it's toys and games. And I'd get it back to the warehouse, open it up, and find out what it was. Yeah.
Okay. A lot of the arcade ports to the NES are easier than the arcade version. Was that made intentional to make the ports easier on the console version?
Okay, so the question is, a lot of the ports of the arcade games are easier on the console than they are in the arcade. So the question is, are you talking about just all games or just Nintendo games?
Did Nintendo make their games easier on the console? Was that an intentional thing? Or
Actually, so with an arcade, obviously you're playing up to the extent of your capability, and then you're bouncing against that wall, and then you're putting in more money and doing that again. And so you got to keep that short enough so that for the quarters that you put in, you're not giving away 10 minutes. To most people, you're giving away 3 to 5 minutes. But for a play experience, it's not satisfying if you sit down there and bang your head against the wall, even if you can progress sooner. Later, maybe not sooner, but later you can progress. So we extended that out and made it a little bit easier. And I know for purists it's kind of a bummer, right? Because you like the exact, the same challenge that you get in the arcade. And it's really kind of interesting because some companies, even today, who spend millions and millions of dollars, I'm not going to name names, but they think that everybody should be able to finish every game. And I go, everybody finish every game? Where's the fun and challenge and sense of yayas when you do it? If you feel like any schmo can do it, but that seems to be more the common feeling these days. Yeah.
I was just curious about your role in Nintendo Power. Tell us a little bit about how that started out.
Oh, sure. It was really fun because I was really the resident game expert, and I say that because nobody else was charged with being aware of all the different games and all the different elements within the games. And I was co-editor with Gail Tilden, who was really strong, powerful marketing publishing person. And she really took the lead on all the operations associated with the magazine. My role was to make sure that it was all accurate and interesting. And so we'd say what should we do with, the next version, the next issue on, and we'd sit down in an editorial meeting and talk about the games. And I'd say, well, I think this, and this thing are the cool things that we should really talk about and highlight, because I think gamers are just going to love it. But the coolest thing about Nintendo Power, this gets back to the black cars and white cars and lime green cars, was when we first started playing video games, it was just the one screen. And then we started getting a couple screens. And then suddenly we got this big long length of screens. And it was so much that you start writing, you start drawing pictures yourself, and to remind yourself where things were. When games got so big, you go, man, we always feel like you're looking through a toilet paper tube at the screen when you realize the world is this big, but you can't see it all. And then, in Japan, Famicom Magazine came out. And Famicom, they got this screen capture device, machine, that cost them about 12 grand, which back then was a lot of money. And what they could do with that is take a high fidelity screen grab of whatever they were playing. And what they would do is then they'd have somebody play that thing, and then they'd sit there and they'd take a screen, go a little further, they'd take a screen, go a little further, and then they'd take all of those, they'd print them out, they'd print it out just like a little Polaroid, and they'd cut them out with an X-Acto and paste them onto boards. So when I go over to Japan, we did the production of the magazine was done over in Japan. I'd go over there and they have these huge boards on the wall. Sometimes they didn't get quite that big, but maybe a quarter that size, that were just filled with all these things that they'd stamped on. So suddenly you could see the entire world. And it was so cool, again, from having this experience of just looking through this toilet paper tube, and then suddenly somebody has the ability to show you the entire world space. And so Nintendo Power to me was particularly cool because we got to see all the world space. And then also because, the tips and tricks and, the little secret stuff that we did. But my role there was basically just to be co-editor on it. Yeah, sorry, even the, yeah.
Secure the main for the warehouse, hire, take a lot of stuff home.
Pardon?
Take a lot of stuff home. The warehouse, take a lot of games home.
It's like anything. When you've got so much of it, it loses its value. You don't have to have it around it. We just had games everywhere all the time. Everybody did who worked at the company. And it wasn't until we started hiring on people to do some of the assembly work, etc., that we started having a problem with loss and things like that. It was the worst job I had at Nintendo was I was the warehouse manager. I told you that, but I also had to do inventory. So I had to do quarterly inventory. For arcade games, piece of cake, right? You just go out there and there's 435 of them. We lost one and we tried to figure out where it went. We had the serial number for it. But then when it came to these Game & Watches, where we would have 100,000 of them, all these different models, and then we had the Nintendo system, and then all these games and all the different versions of it. It would take me at least 2 or 3 days nonstop to do the inventory. I just hated it. But hold on, just a second. Yeah.
So there was one trade show, I think in '88, where Nintendo had a knitting machine.
Oh, I didn't put that. I have a.
You
I actually have a.
I
have a.
I want to see it because no one's ever seen it.
I have a flyer for it, which I brought, and I took a picture of, but I didn't include it.
Well, I was going to ask what you remember about that, and if you remember any other sort of wacky gizmos that didn't happen.
So our house, this is now, we moved up to Redmond from Tukwila. We had a new building that we built. And still warehouse manager, and then, although I had somebody working for me, he was kind of the right-hand man, did almost all the work, so it's just a name only. But we get in a box, and toys and games, Japanese writing, open this thing up, and there's this big white knitting machine that works with the Famicom. And we had, cool games were starting to come out then. We got this knitting machine. And I said, Mr. Arakawa, there's this knitting machine. He says, yes, you need to demonstrate, you need to give a demonstration. I said, what? He says, you need to give a demonstration because Charles Lazarus, who's the head of Toys R Us, is coming in tomorrow, and I want you to give him a demonstration. So I had to learn how to use the knitting machine. It was just awful. I mean, because you have to string each thing, and then when you're done, you push go, and then it tells you it gives you a map, and okay, now string them this way. And then you run the Traveler, and then you push the button, and the Traveler pushes the button on the controller, and it changes the screen to the next. It was the most horrible thing. But I guess Toys R Us wasn't interested, and so it went on its merry way. Yeah.
Off the top of my head, like Nintendo's the only company that I can think of that, like, from one country to another, the console design changed. So I was wondering if you have any anecdotes on why Famicom became the NES, like the design, how the change in the process.
So the question is differences in the design between like the NES and the Famicom and other things. There's a couple things that were kind of predictable no-brainers. One was, for instance, really short cords. It just has to do with culturally smaller living spaces in Japan versus in the US, larger living spaces. Also legal hassles where you have to have the cord has to be able to pull out, because if the cord can't pull out, then some baby can wrap their neck around it and fall and hang on it, or something like that. Actually, it's a funny story. Game & Watch. So this little, I didn't bring it with me. The little Game & Watches on the back of them had this little plastic tab you could slide off, and in it you put in 2 LR44, the little small batteries. Well, somebody decided that babies were going to eat those batteries. So we had to, I'm the warehouse manager. I've got all of these things, I've just counted, 120,000 of them. Mr. Arakawa says we need to put baby don't eat the battery dots on the back of each one of these. So we had to take every single Game & Watch we had, over 100,000 of them. So I had a crew of people coming into this. We had to unpackage everything, and then we had these little orange stickers. They were just round stickers that you stuck so that it held across the edge of the plastic slide there to keep the babies from sliding that open and then eating the batteries. But actually, it was unfortunate. I don't know how many of you know kind of more of the specifics and details of Nintendo, but Lance Barr has been industrial designer for them for many, many years. He was hired by Don James, who actually got me into the company initially. And Lance did the original design of the ABS, which is the sleeker design and the zapper. And then he ended up, they sent that back to Japan, and Japan said, very nice, but we like this design, and basically forced him to redesign it into the lunchbox. What everybody calls the lunchbox now, at least we did. And it was really a cost issue. The belief was that it was less about the style of the console and more about the games. That may have changed a little bit now. We've got these really amazing looking devices that you're proud to have on your stereo shelf, whether it's a PS3 or an Xbox, or maybe you think Xbox is inhale shape is ugly or something. But that's the intent, is become much more focused on it. Yeah.
Was there any one time, or I guess event that happened during the NES X market period, the 85, where you still
I'm sorry, I'm having a real hard time here.
I was going to ask, is there any one specific event or anything that happened during the test market period of the NES when you finally said, well, wow, this is going to be very successful, this is going to take off?
So the question is, was there ever a period of time, test marketing, et cetera, with NES where it was really clear that it was going to be successful? The second that I and others in the warehouse played the Famicom, and the games were exactly like in the arcade. To us, what you had. So there's a period of time when we played Pong, and then we got some arcade games, and then we got some home video games, and that was cool because then you could sit around with your friends and play baseball on Atari, even though it's a little, not great characters, but it was still fun because you'd be up there at bat and somebody pitched this 1 pixel or 4 pixel ball, however big it was. It was really fun and challenging and great fun to do. And then the arcade started getting powerful, so we'd ping pong back and forth between home arcade and then home and then arcade. And then suddenly, when you could play the same thing at home as we were seeing in the arcades at that time, it was just a no-brainer that it was going to be great. And then Mario Brothers came out, and it's like, whoa! And Mario Brothers didn't work in the arcade because it was such a long play, but it was perfect for a home. Yeah.
So the expansion port on the NES, anything ever get prototyped or anything ever actually plug into that thing?
Well, yes. So they did the Famicom. They did a disc system in Japan.
For the U.S. market?
Yeah, we didn't do that. Didn't do that in the U.S. because the market was so robust here that we could have, and technology developed a little bit that we could have MMC chips plus battery backup, so we didn't need the disc. The technologies just kind of did an end run around the need for this big piece of hardware, and also the kind of having multiple types of media. But there was a period of time just after I left Nintendo where Nintendo was, Sega come out with the Sega CD and Sewer Shark and things like that, and everybody's talking about full motion video and video games, and so Nintendo went on record and had a developer conference which I participated in because I was a developer then working for another company, and they were pitching how they're going to have their CD-ROM, and they ran for a long ways with it while all the development community ran behind them saying, okay, particularly ones that were companies that maybe had big movie properties were particularly interested in that kind of full motion video capability, like Lucasfilm where I was. But unfortunately then they just said no. So we kind of had to take our, fold our tent with all the lost in development. But there wasn't any other big things. Yeah.
Do you have any insight on the screw-up, I could say, about the Atari getting the licensing for the Famicom when it first came to the US?
I don't. I was just the first couple of years in the company, I was really just a guy in the warehouse and wasn't aware of what was going on business-wise. I know that there was Arakawa was really scrambling to make a market, a new market for an existing business in Japan. In Japan, Nintendo was a big successful toy company. Yamauchi was happy with that. Here's his son-in-law who's just graduated, I think graduated in MIT or somewhere up in Vancouver. Anyway, he was wanted to do something, and so he's just basically scrambling to see if he can find a business for the Japanese products outside of Japan. And I think some of the initial work of trying to do licensing work with folks like Atari, etc., was part of that. Yeah.
A lot of the industry pundits, the game industry, are predicting that people like me about saying iPad and tablets, this will be the end of the Nintendo will fail, that there will be no more consoles. 2013 will be the end of the industry, and all games will be future games will be played on iPads and tablets. What do you think of that?
You want me to be a pundit? So the question is, so a lot of people are saying it's maybe the end of the consoles because of the handheld devices, the iOS devices, and pads and tablets, and etc. In my opinion, is that I got to see I've got to see huge sea change in the industry based on product and customer win, and good product design and customer win. And every time we're kind of getting towards the peak of one of these product cycles, everybody is just convinced that it's not going to change, it's just going to continue. So with Nintendo, in 8-bit Nintendo, we were convinced we had 90% of the market share. No way is somebody like Sega going to be able to unseat us, let alone somebody like Sony. I mean, Sony was a nothing company. They had just moved into licensing music back in the early 90s, and they did some music hardware, but they had nothing to do with kind of interactive entertainment. So nobody thought Sony was going to come in. But Sega came in and did their more open system with regard to the type of content. So they had more violent, they allowed more violent content. They allowed more sexual innuendo than Nintendo did. Nintendo really wanted themselves to be positioned as the Disney, if you will. And so they kind of gave away the market as all these kids who in 85, 6, and 7 got older and were looking to kind of distance themselves from their younger siblings. They didn't have anything to do with the Nintendo family, so they ended up going great. Here's Sega with Blood Codes and Mortal Kombat and on and on and on. And then Sony came along with disc media. And back by that time, their cartridges, so I was exposed to what the hard costs were for all this stuff. And some of the cartridges were costing over $40 just to the licensee or the Nintendo, because they had so many components on the cartridges. And that is a rare case, but you had these cartridges just packed with chips. And Sony just did an end run and said, well, we don't care about the cart business. We're going to do something new, and we're going to do 3D. All the games when they first came out for the PlayStation were required to be 3D. And then also they worked on that media. And that media was much more attractive to the development community because the cost was so low that even if Sony said we're going to gouge and take 30%, it's not like taking $42 out of a product that there's no way you can sell for more than 60. So that did a big change. And then, along comes lumbering Microsoft with Xbox, and I don't know, I think they pretty much muscled their way by dropping a couple billion into a position in the industry. And I think we'll see another more change. And certainly Apple with iOS has done tremendous things. I really love it as a gaming platform, particularly because it gets back to the shorter gameplay cycles that I grew up on, where growing up playing in an arcade where I play for 2 or 3 minutes to challenge myself. And so we're kind of back to that, and that's fun. But that said, I think it's really all dependent on consumer noise, and consumers change over a period of time, and they look to new and different stuff. So I don't think that we're going to see consoles completely go away. I think the Kinect and the Wii thing are interesting, and we're just waiting kind of for the. I'm not saying that that we're going to shift from iOS or tablet devices back to that, but I think that they're going to continue in some form for gameplay. Yeah.
Going back to the early days of Nintendo of America, there's some confusion over the location. Was it set in New York first and then Seattle, or was
when I started, so originally it was Mr. Arakawa, Ron Judy, and Al Stone. Ron Judy and Al Stone were 2 salesmen who came out of the arcade game industry, which was pretty interesting back then. Anyway, and they really didn't need an office. They just had temporary warehouse space for these things that they bring in on the boat and then sell to somebody. They'd sell to distributors. They didn't sell direct to the end user, to the 7-Eleven or something. They would sell to distributors who were located around the country, and then those distributors would either operate themselves or sell them to operators. And so they really didn't need much for a business. So it was just those 3 guys running around with a bunch of consultants like Howard Lincoln helping with legal stuff, but not on payroll. And then when they needed to do this big conversion of all these games into something new, Donkey Kong, and they were facing its shipping matters. It takes a lot longer for boats to get all the way to New York than it does for them to get to Seattle. And even though if you look at it on a map, you'd think that it's higher up or further away, but it's actually a little bit shorter than it is to go across from to LA. So it's pretty fast to get boats from Japan to Seattle. And in the arcade industry, weeks matter. I mean, you can sell. We sold 120,000 Donkey Kongs in the space of a year and a half. If you do the math on that, you can sell an awful lot of games in a month's time. So if you miss a month, we're talking about millions of dollars in lost opportunities. So it was worth it to them to be able to get them on the ground and in trucks as soon as possible by moving to the Seattle area. So we had rented a small 60,000 square foot, 30,000 square foot warehouse facility. We ended up with 210 because of Donkey Kong. We just needed to store them all. My peak weekend was I got 119 40-foot containers in one day. I had to bring all of those in. And Mr. Arakawa didn't want us to leave any games out on the outside because he figured they'd get stolen. We'd had a couple instances where people would steal the entire trailer if we left it parked outside. So we had to bring them all in every single day. Other questions? I don't know where I am on time, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay, since you played a lot of games, are there any interesting Easter eggs that you know of like the old school games that not many people have found?
So the question is, are there Easter eggs that I'm aware of that old schoolers or other people haven't found? Probably not. Probably not. I mean, we've all got our list of things that we could do. That's actually one of the interesting things about the job back then was one of the things that we did is we were charged with trying to break games. So things like finding the ability to get to the corners in Metroid and go into different places where you weren't supposed to, and minus worlds and stuff like that. We were forever trying to bust things, and some people have an ability to do that because they are a little more random, and other people a little more methodical, and I was one of those random people. So it's always fun when you'd be playing along and all of a sudden something had happened, and then you go, is it a bug, or is it something that, have I found a secret? So it was always fun to do that, but there's so much energy now goes into pushing noses in every corner of every game and doing all sorts of different things that I think there's probably not a lot that hasn't been discovered. So that almost time up, so 2 more questions and that's it. Yes,
well, I just wanted to follow that up. Do you remember any really funny or interesting bugs that you found?
Okay, 2. I told somebody this one earlier today. Master Blaster. Who played Master Blaster by SNK?
Sunsoft.
Oh yeah, Sunsoft. So at the end of the game, I think it's at the end of the game, the big guy comes out, roar, and you gotta fight him. So here I am playing the game. It's been submitted it's been released in Japan, but it's being submitted for approval for US release. So the big guy comes out at the end of the game, roar. He's well endowed. Below his knee well endowed. And so I look at it and go, wow. I show the guys around me, do you see? And they say, yeah. So I walked I did a videotape and I took it down to Juana Tingdale, who's Howard Lincoln's assistant in legal, and I said, Juana, can you look at this and just tell me if, maybe it's the guy's tail from behind or something, but I don't know, when I'm looking at it, and so I say, just tell me what you see. And she looks at it and says, well, that's a penis. So anyway, we wrote the email to Sunsoft, and they actually back then it was faxes. We didn't have emails, we did faxes. And the next day the guy just went whack. And then the last one, you are all familiar with the debacle around the connectors and the dirty connectors, etc. The way we first became aware of that it was any kind of a issue that we should even be concerned about, was some mother called up the game counselors, and it suddenly it kind of became the talk of the game counselors, and then Howard Lincoln was involved, and Mr. Aricon wanted to know what was going on. Well, what had happened is dirty connectors allow you to get some data corruption or missing data, and on the title screen, you guys are going to have to use your imagination. On the title screen, it said duck hunt. And honest, the mother said she came in and her kids were playing, and the screen said, it didn't say duck, and it didn't say hunt. And so, we get this, we go, really? Are you kidding me? So, run back to our desk, plug in the cartridge, start doing this with our cartridges, scrambling, and all of a sudden, whoa! Yeah. So that's why we had to do the whole sending out all of those cleaners for free. Hey, thank you very much to everybody. If you have any questions or anything, it's great to reminisce with you about what was a wonderful period in hopefully all of our lives. We were really lucky to have lived through that. And it's still very interesting today, but what glorious days those were. So thanks very much.